Welcome to this eLearn security video lesson on PowerShell for Pentesters, PowerShell, and Metasploit. In this video, we are going to cover several ways we can both leverage Metasploit to create PowerShell payloads and PowerShell-based sessions, in addition to other techniques we can combine for interoperability between Metasploit payloads and Empire, which we covered in another video. This demonstration assumes you already have a shell on a target system from some other exploit or means, which is the terminal on the right-hand side of the screen. The first thing we'd like to show is how we can create a malicious PowerShell script with MSF Venom that will initiate a connection back to our attacker machine, where we'll first configure a reverse interpreter HTTPS listener. The advantage to this method is that all further exploitation will occur within the PowerShell process on the target system and can help us evade some endpoint defenses, and just shows that it is possible to create PowerShell scripts using MSF Venom. First, let's configure our interpreter reverse HTTPS listener. We'll use the exploit /multi/handler, configure our interpreter reverse HTTPS payload, and set our lhost and lport options. We'll then run the option in the background with the exploit-j command. Now that our listener is configured, let's create our malicious PowerShell script payload. For this, we'll use the psh-reflection file type, which will reflectively load all of the PowerShell functionality via .NET, and also doesn't leave any artifacts on disk, which should be our goal in most cases. Once our PowerShell script has been created, we can then use a download cradle to execute our malicious PowerShell script from the target host, which is the command prompt on the right-hand side of the screen here. However, we'll first need to launch a Python HTTP server on our attacker machine so we can serve the malicious PowerShell script to our target via the download cradle. Now we can download and execute our malicious PowerShell script with a standard net.web client download string cradle from the attacker machine. Once we execute our download cradle, we can see we now have an interpreter session connection back to our Metasploit listener. Another interesting thing to note here is that once we interact with our session, and our target is a Windows 10 machine, we can drop into a shell and simply execute the PowerShell executable, and we should be dropped into an interactive PowerShell console. We now have a fully interactive PowerShell console which we can use to conduct PowerShell-based post-exploitation tasks on our target. Let's now move on to the next topic in PowerShell for Pentesters, PowerShell and Metasploit. In this part of the video, we're going to introduce the Windows PowerShell extension for use with Meterpreter. Once we've gained access to a system and have a Meterpreter session, the extension allows us to execute PowerShell command strings, import scripts, .NET Assembly DLLs, or simply create an interactive PowerShell prompt, and is a stealthy way to run our commands through PowerShell by utilization of this module. This demonstration assumes you already have a shell on a target system from some other exploit or means. In our terminal here, we have an active session on our target with a Meterpreter reverse HTTPS payload. First, let's interact with our current session for a Meterpreter prompt. From here, we can run the load PowerShell command to load the extension. If we type help here, we can see we have several options we can use as part of this extension. First, we can easily enter into an interactive PowerShell with the PowerShell_shell command. For instance, we can interact just like we would in a standard prompt. In this example, we'll simply search for an iTunes-related process. We can exit the previous command by using the Ctrl-Z key combination to send our current channel into the background. We can also execute remote commands with the PowerShell_execute command. As an example, let's see if we can execute the invoke-mimikatz script from the Powersploit repository on GitHub and see if we can dump credentials. We successfully were able to invoke Mimikatz over a download cradle. As we can see, this extension offers us some great PowerShell functions we can utilize from a Meterpreter session, while also taking advantage of operating in PowerShell memory without being detected. In this next segment, we'll demonstrate how we can pass an existing active agent session from Empire over to Metasploit. This is useful in a scenario where you need to pass control of a target system to another command and control type of framework. First, on the Metasploit side, what we'll want to do is use the web_delivery exploit in order to simply generate a payload URL that we're going to use for an Empire agent. Next, we'll want to set a payload. We'll use a Windows/Meterpreter/reverse_HTTPS payload. Now, in the exploit options, we should set our SRV host option. This is the IP that will host the URL to our payload, which will later execute on the Empire agent. We'll also want to set our lhost value for the payload. We can leave the SRV port and L port options as their defaults for this demonstration. Next, we'll want to also set our exploit target to number 2. We can list our exploit targets for this exploit with the show targets command. We can then set our target to 2 with the setTarget2 command. Finally, we can run the exploit command to generate our payload URL. You'll notice that we're presented with the URL and the resulting output of running the exploit command. This is the URL that we're going to copy and remember for when we transfer our Empire agent to Metasploit. Now that we've generated a payload URL, we can configure the Empire side. What we'll want to do here is use the invoke_metasploit payload module. We can load that with the following command. Now, if we run the info command on this module, you can see that one of our values we need to provide is the URL value. This is where we use the URL that was provided via the web_delivery exploit on Metasploit. And we'll also set our agent value to the agent we'd like to transfer over to Metasploit. Finally, we can type the execute command. We can see at this point we've successfully transferred our Empire agent over to Metasploit and can now interact with what was a target that we had compromised with the Empire framework. And this concludes our video lesson on PowerShell for Pentesters, PowerShell, and Metasploit. Thank you for joining us.